Today at Groves Automotive, we're going to get started on our Project Z. We're going to be showing you how to replace the front struts, the rear shocks, and the rear springs on a Z3. A few days ago, we went up to our storage lot and we got this car out of the weather. The back was filled with a good bit of water. It had about 10 inches of water in the back, and we vacked all that out. And we actually did a pre-purchase inspection on this car once we got it down to the shop. And you can check that out on an earlier video we put out a few days ago, just noting on how to accurately do your pre-purchase inspection so you know the quality and the condition of your car. Once we did that, we noticed the suspension really needed replacement. The front struts and the rear shocks were leaking fluid out of them, and also they're just way too soft. And since all the fluid's leaked out, it leads to a really cushiony ride and almost too much body roll. So what we're going to do today is put on shocks and struts from a 2000 year model BMW Z3 Coupe. This was off an M model car, so the valving in the shocks and the struts are going to be a lot stiffer, also is the spring rate. It's really going to enable this car to handle a lot better in backcountry roads and when it's applied in a race car type event, anything like that. I got a lot of work I need to be doing on my car today, so I'm going to be getting Jacob, the cameraman, the guy behind the camera, and Jay helping us out today, putting on these shocks and struts. Jay's already done the first step, and that's going to be removing the wheel. All you're going to need is a 17mm socket, and you're going to need a tire iron, an impact, or something to get your wheel off. And after you do that, we're going to get to the next step. The next step is going to remove the top hat bolts, and those are 3 13mm nuts, and you just simply take them right off. And after you get your 3 top hat nuts off, you're going to notice your strut's going to fall about an inch or so. And after that, it's time to get to the bottom side of the vehicle and take your knuckle bolt off, take your 2 strut bolts off, and also disconnect the brake line, the ABS sensor, and anything else that's attached to your strut. Now that we've dropped the strut and taken our 3 top hat nuts loose, the next thing we're going to want to get to is taking the front knuckle bolt off. So we got an 18mm nut on this side, and on the other side an 18mm bolt. Jay, go ahead and stick your impact on that side. Let's go ahead and buzz it loose. All right, that bolt rust a lot of the times, the lodges up in there, so Jay, go ahead and get a hammer and go ahead and beat it out.
I whacked it good.
Now that we've taken the front knuckle bolt out, we're going to need to take loose these 2 bolts right here. They're also 18mm. So go ahead, Jay, take your impact and buzz those 2 off.
There.
You got it?
Yeah, turn up the floor.
Okay.
Out of electricity.
All right. Now what we're going to want to do, now that we've taken all the bolts and all the nuts off of our strut, we're going to want to take a pry bar and pry on the very bottom, almost at the rotor, on the very bottom of the strut to pry it off. The front knuckle, it gets a little rusty and it doesn't like to come off, so it takes a little bit of assistance from a pry bar. So go ahead, Jay, and stick the pry bar up there, and I'm going to hold the top of the strut.
Here, hold up just a second, man. Watch. I'm gonna lower this down towards me.
I can't see on that side of it. You got it?
See, it's these stupid things right here. It just keeps catching these lines, man.
Right now. This is a good time to go over some differences in the 2 struts themselves. The reason that this M Coupe strut is going to be a lot better is because, as you can tell, the physical difference right here. This is the factory strut off of the other side we've already done, and this is the strut that we're about to put in this side. The difference is in the negative camber up front and the top hat. This is called a camber plate, and there's a little bit of a range of adjustment in the physical unibody of this car. But as you can see from right here, this is the very center of the strut. If we pop this cap off, that's going to be the nut where the strut goes itself. See here, this is in the middle almost, and then this is almost on this side of it. And the reason for that is this is going to give us a lot more negative camber. Negative camber is really, really good, and let me give you a simple overview of what negative camber does. So if we look at a wheel and we look at a tire and it's leaned straight up and down like this will be 0 negative camber at all. And as we lean this tire over more and more, it's got more and more negative camber. Now if we went the opposite way and we lean that tire out like this, past that center point, it's gonna be positive camber. Get my strut from falling over. So basically the reason that's important is because the higher and higher cornering loads we have on this car, the more G-force we have on the, when you drive the car, you're gonna need to lay that tire over more and more. And that's gonna be what this strut does. So it's probably gonna lay it over, I don't know, maybe a half a degree or a degree more of negative camber. And then we're gonna need to get an alignment to get this car in this setup and to get this new setup dialed in. So what this negative camber does is it leans that tire over, so when you're in a corner and you have all your suspension loaded up, the maximum contact patch of the tire is hitting the road. You're not gonna have the tire roll up as if 0 negative camber. 0 degrees is bad because what's gonna happen is when you load that tire up, it's gonna roll over on that tire's shoulder and you're not gonna get the maximum contact patch. So that's the reason you wanna lay this over, the reason this strut does right here, lay it over like that, and that way when you're in a corner and everything's loaded up and you're pulling some G-force, that tire, the flat part, the maximum contact patch is on the ground because that tire is laid over and it's gonna be gripping the road. One more thing about these is, in addition to the negative camber and the difference in the top plate, just like I mentioned earlier, the spring rates are going to be much stiffer on this M Coupe strut than the factory strut on this Z3, and also the dampening. The valving in these, the shock is going to be a lot stiffer and a better valve for high-speed cornering, that type of thing. Now that we've taken our factory OEM strut out, it's time to go ahead and get our M Coupe strut, and we're going to go ahead and put it up in place. So we've already set it up in place, and what you're going to want to do now is look at the orientation of the top hat and make sure the top hat bolts are going to go through the holes in the unibody. So let me do that. That's good enough. All right, and once we get those nuts started, we can just kind of let the strut hang just like that. After we get the top hat nuts started again and we've got our strut hanging, the next thing we want to do is start with that front knuckle bolt. So go ahead and Jay, put that front knuckle bolt through, and you're going to notice we're going to have to play with the alignment and get it somewhat aligned, and then we'll be able to get that bolt started through.
Hold on a second. That thing, yeah, you gotta come. This thing's gotta come this way.
Okay.
There we go.
And once you get the bolt through, all you really have to do for right now is just get that nut on and get it finger tight, and then you can stop. You're good there. After you get that front knuckle bolt in, you're going to want to go ahead and take your two 18mm strut bolts that go on the very bottom and go ahead and put those in. So Jay, go ahead and put the one in on the one side, then you can go ahead and go to the next side. And you might have to play with some alignment to get things to line up exactly right. You want to make sure you start your nuts, you want to make sure you start your bolts exactly straight, because if you start them and they get tight, that's probably an indication you're going to strip the threads. You don't want to do that, and you don't want to start anything crooked, so make sure everything's started straight. Looks like you got it. Now after we started our bottom two 18mm bolts and the top knuckle bolt, it's 18mm nut and bolt, we're going to go ahead and tighten up these bottom two. So Jay, go ahead and take your impact or your ratchet and go ahead and tighten those up. All right, and those two are tight. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten this front knuckle bolt. All right, and all those are tight. Now that we've gotten our strut tightened up, the next thing we're gonna move on to is by getting the ABS wire, the brake line, and the brake sensor wire. We're gonna get those all clipped in on our new clip on our new strut. Sometimes it can take quite a bit of force to shove in place. Now you're going to notice a few differences on this M Coupe strut and the factory Z3 strut. On the M Coupe and the M Roadster, the sway bar is going to be retained on the actual strut itself. And on the Z3, just the base, the non-Ms, it's going to be done a little bit different. It's retained down on the factory control arm. So this right here, even though this looks different from the other strut we had in this car, don't mind it. Don't pay attention to it at all. It doesn't matter. Our sway bar is still connected on the control arm on this car, so it's still gonna function just like it did before. After we've got our front struts all buttoned up, it's time to move on to the rear. So we're gonna go ahead and start by taking the rear wheel off. And Jay's already done that for us. The next step is gonna be taking the bolt out of the lower shock mount. So we're gonna go ahead and start by taking this 18mm bolt out. Come on over, Jay. Use your impact and go ahead and break it loose. Now, once we have our lower shock bolt already out, the next thing we're gonna wanna do is take the sway bar end-link bolt out, or the nut off at the bottom, and this is gonna give us the ability to take a pry bar and pry down on this lower control arm and create a little bit of gap to get this spring out. So Jay, go ahead and buzz this nut off. And you're gonna see that the whole lower control arm actually drops down a few inches, and that's exactly what we're doing this for. So now we can go ahead and get that spring out. Now that we've got our sway bar end link and our rear shock unbolted from the bottom, it's time to go ahead and get a buddy to lend a hand and go ahead and pry up on the bottom of the spring, just like that. And the spring will pop right out. Now that we've taken our rear shock loose and we've taken our rear spring already out, we need to take the upper mounts for the shock loose. So for that, we need to lower our vehicle so we can get in the interior. We want it almost down to the ground to where we can easily get in the inside of this car. And then there'll be 2 nuts we need to take off to get our shocks completely out. The next step is going to be getting in the interior of your Z3, and this is not very fun because it's kind of a tight spot. We're going to need to look behind the rear seats, look behind the headrest thing, and after that, after you pull the carpet up, you're going to see a little black bubble that protrudes, and that's the very top of our strut, or that's the very top of our shock in the back. And there's going to be 2 13mm nuts on studs that are attached to this shock that we're going to need to take loose. So let's go ahead and get our ratchet with our 13mm on it. Start breaking those loose. They're not super tight, so you don't have to use a ratchet with a bunch of leverage. And once they get to a certain point, you can start spinning them loose with your hand. There's one on the back, so go ahead and take that one off. And as you can notice, our shock is getting loose. It's gonna fall here in a minute when I get this nut totally off. I think I've got it loose enough so I can start loosening it with my hand. All right, and now that the 2 nuts are off, we can go ahead and pull this cap off, and the strut will fall, and the shock will fall out. The next step is, after we get our old shock out, we're gonna go ahead and get Jay to stick our new shock up in and find the holes. And then you can start one nut. All right, Jay, shove it up a little bit more on that back side if you can. There you go. Now that we've got Jay to help us stick our shock in the back, the next thing we're gonna wanna do, start our nuts. And after we start them, we're gonna wanna go ahead and start tightening. And that front one's now snug. All right. All right, now the shock, the top mount on the shock for the rear is now snug on the top, so we're good to go. We can go ahead and get out of the vehicle. After we've got our new shock tightened up from the top, the next step is gonna be to get Jay, come on over, and we're gonna put our rear spring in. Make sure it's got the upper and lower spring perches on it. Now we're gonna wanna do is I'm gonna pull down on this lower control arm to assist Jay just a little bit.
Come up.
Now after we've got our rear spring in, it's gonna be necessary to get you a 4-jack, or if you're on a full lift like we are today, get a screw jack. And this is necessary because we're trying to get, this is the mounting point for the rear shock, the lower point, and this is the actual point, the rear shock itself. So we're gonna need to make up that distance there. So this spring is under tension, it's under spring pressure. So we're gonna jack it up with our screw jack until it looks about the right height. How's that looking, Jay?
Stop.
Sorry. And after you get that started, you can go ahead and grab your impact wrench or your ratchet or whatever you're using to tighten it up with and go ahead and snug it up. Enough. Now that Jay's tightened up our bottom shock bolt, it's an 18 millimeter. Now that he's got that tight, we can go ahead and take our screw jack and take pressure off of this. So we can let the pressure off the jack, and you can notice that our spring is now tight in its place and it's not gonna move around. And the next step on this side would be technically to put our sway bar end link back down and put our nut on. But since we haven't done our other side yet, we're gonna need to leave this loose, because what taking this loose does is it allows this lower control arm to swing down another 2 or 3 inches, and that gives you the required space to get the spring out. So after we get our other side knocked out, we'll go ahead and reattach this and tighten up our nut. After we've got both of our rear shocks and both of our rear springs in place, the final piece of the puzzle is going to be putting this nut on the sway bar end link. So come on over, Jay, and go ahead and put that 13 millimeter nut on. And after you thread it up on, you can just grab a ratchet or a wrench or impact, whatever you're using, and go ahead and snug it up. Now that we've finished up with our install, let's go ahead and let the Z off the lift and lower it down to the ground to see how much lower it actually is. Now that we're all buttoned up with our M-Coupe front strut and rear spring and rear shock install, now it's time to end this episode. I hope you guys liked what you saw here today. Be sure to click like, subscribe, and comment below if there's anything you want to see. And stick around for the next evolution of this build. We're going to be stripping some weight out of it and adding some wheels to it and continuing the evolution. So I hope you like what you saw today. Be sure to click subscribe.